We're here today in the city cemetery in Sacramento to talk about Victorian symbolism and burial customs. Now, let's go back a little further in time before Queen Victoria began her reign, and let's talk about world history in a cemetery sense. Most burials in world history, especially in Europe, were done in churchyard areas. So around the building itself, there would be many crosses and headstones for all of the individuals that were members of the church. And what would happen is that the first person in the family that would die, they would be buried the deepest. And then they would, in succession, bury that person's family members on top or right next to, until you get to the point that most cemeteries would fill up very fast with a plague or some type of outbreak of some type of sickness. It was very easy to fill up churchyards and the areas around. And what happened is that a good heavy rain or flood would come along, and now you have coffins and bodies coming up out of the ground. So when the Victorian era was established, the individuals, especially here in the United States, started to view things ever so slightly different. Now, most of these people had a different way at looking at death. It's not just a finality. Death was another part of the journey of life. So, what was reverent when a person was born and how they lived would be reflected in how they died and how they passed on, and memories left behind for those that are left to grieve these individuals. And here at the city cemetery, it is a very large amount of property because people were normally buried next to each other, not necessarily on top of each other. Here in Sacramento, it's called the New Cemetery, and it was very close to the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers and very low land level, and it started to flood here in the 1850s, and they were afraid of bodies coming up out of the ground. So they established this cemetery in 1849, very far from what was the center of Sacramento. At the time, this was not an incorporated area of the city of Sacramento, and so this was high ground. And in fact, during the 1850s, when it flooded here, people would actually come here and wait out the flood waters until they receded, and then they'd head back to their homes, sometimes to rebuild them if there was anything left. So this cemetery has a lot of reflection on what the people of the Victorian era valued. They were very heavy into Greek and Roman architecture and to Egyptian architecture, and some of the large buildings here, which are called mausoleums, were from the word tomb, which was an ancient Middle Eastern term for burial ground or building. And so these mausoleums here were for some of the most important or rich individuals that died here during the Victorian era of the city of Sacramento, and in fact most of the United States. Even if it's a flat land area, you will see a lot of above ground burials with mausoleums. Now, what we're going to discuss here is some of the wonderful things you will find with a monument. And I thought today we would start with one of my favorites. This was a gentleman by the name of Harry Snow. He died here in 1882, a very young man, only 26 years old. Now, most people, when they look at this monument, think, well, Harry must have been a librarian or a man that was a scholar. Well, yes, he was a scholar, but he was a top-notch young attorney or lawyer here in the city of Sacramento. In fact, he was part of many large court cases here in Sacramento at that time, and died very young. So his friends and family members decided to honor what he so very much prized, which was his passion for research and for the law, the legal word. And so they erected this headstone in memory of him, with all of these wonderful books just piled together, as attorneys' offices probably even to this day are just full of volumes of books so you can quote and research law. So there's Harry Snow. Make our way along, and as we are going to this area, you can see beautiful monuments of every type, obelisks, very much an Egyptian hands up to or hands clasping to, because Egyptian architecture was very much prized by the Victorians. And we have here, this particular one is, here rests a woodman of the world, and you can see that there's a dove with a branch, olive branch for peace, and some wood, and this particular saying, which says "Dum tacit clemat," and what that meant was here rests a woodman of the world. And the wonderful thing about this is that you will never see the word lie or lies on any headstone of a woodman of the world, because their profession was that they never lied. So here rests a woman of the world. All right. And there were quite a few. That was a benevolent society here in Sacramento and in the state of California. Many important men who were also, some of the other benevolent societies were also woodmen of the world. As we make our way along, you're going to see headstones of every type. That is interesting. You can see on the top of this particular monument an urn, and on top of the urn is a shroud. This usually was to honor somebody who was very important here in the city of Sacramento, or important to his family, and in deep sorrow they erected this monument with the urn and shroud. And there's also on the sides of this monument there is seashell, and it's very, very hard to actually depict, but the seashell was a sign of eternal life and rising again. So this man may have been a very religious individual as well. All right. We're going back up this direction. Some of my favorite headstones are in the Masonic section of the cemetery. Now this is the pioneer Masonic or old Masonic section of the city cemetery. So everyone buried here is of Masonic brotherhood, or perhaps a wife of someone that was a Mason. A full life and rejoicing was a wreath, and if it was broken like this one, it was a life that was full, but also maybe died very young. But this particular person was 1946 to 2019, so that's still pretty young. And you can see the Celtic symbol there in the middle. So that person with the last name of Togger may have had Scottish or English or Irish ancestry to them. Going along, you can see a lamb on top of a headstone, and this particular one says, the beloved daughter of Thomas and Mary Ross. Her name was Annie Ross. And she was born 1867 and died 1875. So she was just a young girl when she passed away. And a lamb on top of a headstone was a sign of a child being buried here. So very sad. And they actually erected it right next to their headstones as well. So this whole plot is just this one family right here. Going along, we see some of the Masonic symbols. We have here the square and compass, which was their, and still is, their signature symbol of their benevolent brotherhood. And they are some of the most wonderful people you will ever meet. They won't talk about themselves unless you ask them, but these individuals would help, and still do help, people that have an unfortunate situation, that are maybe deaf or blind, and they have actual schools for them where they can learn to recover from their ailments and perhaps function better in society. And if a man that is a Mason dies, his wife and children need never worry about a place to live with a roof over their heads or food in their bellies, because Masons made sure that these individuals are always cared for regardless. Now, we see here a flagpole, and along with this flagpole we have a very tall monument, the tallest monument in this section, and this is, of course, the burial monument for John Bigler, who was the 3rd governor of the state of California. He was also a U.S. ambassador to Chile, and he even was here in 1850 during the cholera epidemic. And even though he caught cholera, he still helped both doctors and undertakers with the disposal of the dead bodies, and also with the burials, and also with those that were sick, helping to treat them. And you can see this compass and square on his headstone. And because the fact he was governor of California, and he also was very friendly with a lot of the Native Americans in the Truckee area of California, they renamed that beautiful lake called Tahoe Lake Bigler in his honor. And unfortunately, when the years went by, a lot of people considered him of a racist type of attitude. So in the 1900s, by 1945, they decided to officially rename Tahoe Tahoe, and got rid of the name Bigler for that reason. But because he was governor of California, it was just a reflection of the times and how people were at that particular time, that they decided to erect this monument in his honor. And at one time, you can tell that there were maybe urns of some type or such here that are no longer part of the plot. And that could be just anybody's guess as to what happened to them. It happens a lot in cemeteries. Things just go missing. Now, one of my favorites on a headstone for symbolism are the hands clasping. Now, this particular one looks like 2 men. It could be sometimes that the blouse or cuff of the sleeve could be that of a woman receiving a man, or a man receiving a woman, but this particular one has the compass and square at the top. It has this curtain being drawn where one is receiving the other one into eternal life, or into heaven. And this was a huge part of Victorian headstone symbolism, that the death of one person just means now they are joining the people that they love. That's one of my favorites. All right, now you're thinking, what is the most iconic symbol that should be in a cemetery, you would think would be angels. Well, my favorite angel in this cemetery looks like the angel of death. Now, you can see here, this is a woman in deep sorrow. A column that has been broken is a life cut short. So perhaps this woman is in mourning, and the angel of death is there to comfort her. A very creepy one in many respects. But this is how cemetery symbolism was. They weren't afraid of death. They were ready to move sometimes to the next part of the circle of life. Look at the crow on the headstone over there. That is very much what October should be in a cemetery. I love it. All right, so let's move on. And we're going to move out of the Masonic section. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about some of the folks that are buried here. And if you need a little help getting out of here, let me know, Susan. There we go. All right. So let's go to the most iconic thing you should ever find in a cemetery. The cross. So this person was a Mason. Here's a compass and square. These three links here meant that this person was an odd fellow. And just like the Masons, just like the Woodmen of the world, the Odd Fellows are another benevolent brotherhood society of the United States. And so not only is compass and square and the links here, but this man was a Christian with the sign of the cross. And the cross was used many times just to mark the grave. Usually wooden, sometimes it would be metal. Many different materials would make up what would signify someone is buried in a particular area. This one's kind of unusual and different, but I think it's one that is unique to this cemetery. So this is the Perkit family. And this particular one talks about this person being a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, or was a son of the American Revolution. And these particular folks are marked with this wonderful piece of granite that came from somewhere up on the Highway 80 corridor, from what I've heard, by Donner Pass. And this is the Tiffy side of the family. This was their monument, and you can see there's a teamster and oxen pulling a Conestoga wagon, which is how so many people did come to the state of California prior to and during and after the gold rush. The main focus after gold is found is everybody wanting to come to California, everybody wanting to get a new life in search of California gold, which was not just finding the gold. It's also finding a new life and such a beautiful area to live that had wonderful seasons and alpine lakes and close to the ocean, things that so many people from the Midwest were nowhere near. This plot right here is also very important. This plot belongs to the Turnbrian Organization, and they are all German immigrants to the state of California and the city of Sacramento. Now, the Turnbrian Organization was one that stresses, even to this day, physical fitness and health. So you can see you have a man, an athlete it looks like, and a discus in his hand. This was what the Turnbrian Organization was based out of, and also, of course, to this day, the Turnbrian building here in Sacramento on J Street has great Oktoberfests. That's all I'm going to say on that one. Another interesting headstone in this section is this one. The only one I've seen here that has a cannon, and that's very unique. I'm not really sure what it's in reference to, but that's the only one I've seen that has something of a war type armory actually engraved on it. So that's very unique to the city cemetery. All right, heading up this way, here's another one with lambs. 2 young boys that died very, very young. And of course they are marked by the lambs on their fathers, or it looks like their father's headstone right next door. There is a cross. And again, crosses were a sign of Christianity, a sign in faith in a higher being, and a lot of this would go into why death was no longer something to be afraid of. It's another part of the journey. More crosses. Wonderful how this one is done with ivy, which was a sign of long life, and father being honoring this man, all right, and mother. For some reason she didn't get quite the beautiful cross that he did, but she has a cross on hers with a scroll. Perhaps had a lot of stories to tell. All right. Again, you can see in the distance another urn with a shroud. Once again, a sign of either deep grief or perhaps someone being honored for having a wonderful life. And another angel. And this one is a slightly different one. This angel is in deep grief with an urn next to it. So this particular individual may have died a very agonizing death, or maybe the loved ones left behind, because it says they were only 27 years, very young person, and a very large impact on those left behind. Heading up this way, watch your step, my dear. We're coming up to probably the most well-known headstones in the city cemetery. Mae Woolsey. Now, a young girl, not only does she have such a wonderful headstone, and you can see some wonderful architecture done in the design with the scroll and the flowers and the wonderful relief around it, but she had left a huge impact on her family when she passed away at the age of 11 or 12. And everything left here are all by those modern day that grieve the loss of a young girl who was a talented artist and a straight-A student. You can see jewelry, you can see coins, rocks, toys, stuffed animals, a lantern maybe to light the way. It's anyone's guess, and pens because she was an avid writer and drawer. What a wonderful, wonderful monument to a young girl. One of my favorites. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of the cemetery. This is the GAR plot, or Grand Army of the Republic, which was the original name for the United States Army. To be buried here, you had to be someone that served in the Civil War. We have here Newton Gould. Newton Gould, who was one of the few Medal of Honor recipients, buried here in the city of Sacramento in the city cemetery, and he was involved in one of the most horrendous battles of Vicksburg. And because of his actions during that battle, he received the Medal of Honor, died many years later, so he was just a young man during that battle. But there were many men who were also awarded the Medal of Honor by President Lincoln and afterwards, and those honors were rescinded. But Newton Gould's was one of the few who had that honor, that it was not rescinded. It was held steadfast. And I thought I'd end today by showing you another angel. We have to do a little bit of walking here. Heading back towards the Pioneer section of the cemetery. And she's got a weed eater going there. Hopefully that doesn't impede us too much. All right, we're going to head up this way. Now, a lot of people want to know what was the earliest burial documented here in the city of Sacramento for the cemetery here. And as far as we have ever been able to tell, it was Captain J.T. Homan's United States Navy, who died July of 1849. And his son is also buried here, and he died in May of 1858. So 1849 was the earliest record of burial here, and you can see this was at one time a very heavy piece. Maybe soft ground or something caused it to fall, and it was damaged in several different places, which they have done their best to erect again into the same spot, and gave a little bit of shoring up on the bottom to make sure that it doesn't fall again. Lastly is the story in Symbolism of Maria Rupp. Now, I'm not going to go into that story too much because who knows what I might talk about next time. But Maria Rupp has an angel on the back part of her headstone here, which has no hands. And it seems to me that if there were hands here, they were cut off pretty well, where you can't even tell that there actually were any to begin with. And at one time in the 1980s, 70s or 80s, they went looking from an old photograph of this plot, and the angel was gone. Well, it was so heavy it sunk into the earth, and they had to bring it back up. And they have put a foundation around it and its cross to make sure that, which the cross had also fallen as well. And it's very hard to read. It was in German, and 1857 when she passed was a long time ago. But that's Maria Rupp's headstone, and this was the headstone for her fiance who died not long after she did. And you can see on this one the hands clasping. It's a man's shirt cuff and a woman's blouse. She is accepting him into heaven. And so that is his particular headstone. And that's what we have to say today here in the city cemetery. It's October 1st. Welcome to fall.